Hi, this video may run a little long, I'm going to warn you. But if you don't watch this video and think you're going to refill like crazy and have everything work correctly, you may regret this. Now, it's not a warning, it's not dangerous, it's just that I want you to understand what goes on, what to watch out for, and how to prevent it so that everything works with hardly any ever having problems. Now let's go over the construction of this cartridge as I've gone through before in a previous video, but I'll recap it just to make sure we understand what goes on. Ink is in here in the sponge, in the reservoir, and we know when the printer prints, it uses the ink from the sponge, it's replenished from the reservoir, and then the sponge remains in a fairly constant state until it's empty. Now somehow the printer's got to know what's going on. So while it's in a constant state, the printer, remember before I told you there's an optical prism here? This optical prism tells the printer there's ink in the reservoir. Now this is important because the minute this ink in the reservoir runs out, the printer knows it, and what it does to make sure that the printhead has ink while it's printing, it starts to pull ink into the printhead with some extra cycles to protect the printhead, because anytime you run the printhead without ink, you risk permanently damaging it. The Canon engineers know this, and they've engineered these things into the printer and how the printer operates to try to minimize that potential problem. So we've got to recognize what they're doing and refill these things properly and know how to refill them properly to make sure that the features that Canon design actually does work for us as well when we refill. Okay, so again, optical prism. Once this optical prism detects no ink, the ink is in here, the printer will start pulling ink out, and then it will empty the cartridge. When the cartridge has run out of ink in the reservoir, the printer pulls ink out of the sponge, and the way we're going to simulate it, the easiest way we could do and suck it out of here, but I'm just going to do this is an analogy. It starts pulling ink out. So as the printer prints and the reservoir is empty, we're simulating the ink coming out of here with this method. It starts using ink from the sponge. At about this point, the printer will indicate that it's empty. Notice how much ink we've got here in the sponge from the time the optical prism is low or that shows no ink. So the printer is expecting this much of ink in the sponge before it goes from low to empty. Very important point. Now the cartridge will look somewhat like this when it reads empty on the printer. This cartridge was removed when it read empty in the printer. If you try to refill this cartridge at this point, notice something. It doesn't want to absorb ink very well like we initially did in the other video. Notice the saturation effect here is gone. It's because once we start getting foam in the sponge, its ability to reabsorb ink is highly compromised. Okay, that's important, and you always get foam into the sponge when you drive your printer down so that the cartridge is completely empty before you try to refill it. Now, this is somewhat of an extreme case, but it drives the point home that whenever we start emptying the sponge, we start getting bits of foam. How much you get is going to vary each time, but this foam builds up and builds up and builds up until you get something like this, which hardly wants to refill. And if you're trying to refill it and use that in the printer, I wouldn't, because you might find that it's going to give problems printing. You always want to get something like this, just like the new cartridge for reliable printing. And here's an extreme case. Look how this thing looks. It's all faded. Now, it doesn't even want to drip ink out. Doesn't even want to absorb ink. That's a locked up cartridge due to foam. And that's going to create major banding, and it's going to say, you're going to say, what's wrong with my printer? The color's not printing, something's wrong. You're complaining something's wrong with the ink, something's gone wrong. Understand that. Take a look. And each time we fill and refill and we get little voids in the sponge, this foam builds up to the point where it may become like that. And at that point, you've got to flush the cartridge, dry it, or get a new cartridge. But please understand, when you drive the printer from low to full empty, then the printer is going to start creating foam because it pulls out more and more ink out of the sponge. Okay, let me go and show you something else. Here, this cartridge has been run till the counter on the printer says low, and at this point we should refill. Refill it until this is saturated and not run. If we let this thing run down till it's empty, it's going to start looking a bit like this. That's not good. This one's been used a bit. The excess ink from the top, like here, that gets used up first, then it starts pulling from the reservoir. Here's another one, same situation. The top layer sponge is emptied, principally of ink, and the bottom is solid. Bottom solid. Always remember that. Bottom solid, and you'll get reliable printing. The minute the bottom starts looking compromised, you may end up with some problems. And the worst thing is, you could burn your printhead out.